Bright City, good morning. How y'all doing? Good seeing you guys. Hey, I want to do something. Just for a second, not more than a second, maybe half a minute, 30 seconds. I just really want to celebrate what God is doing right now, guys. Pastor Ike had mentioned earlier today that we're not meant to be in here. We're not supposed to be in here. But guess what? We are, because God provides. God is providing for us in this space in which we're able to worship and celebrate. So just for 30 seconds, guys, I just want to give a round of applause. I just really want to thank God for what he's doing. You can scream, you can shout, you can do what you want. Praise God. Like, literally, praise God. Praise God. Well, again, if you guys do not know me, my name is Eric Davis. I'm one of the servant leaders here, and I'm so happy and thrilled that you are here with us. For those that are new, again, maybe this is your first day here or your first Sunday with us. Maybe you've been here with us for a few weeks. We want to say thank you. We're honored and privileged that you are with us, and we want to get you connected. There's a few ways in which you can do that. We do this thing here at Bright City called First Step. After the service, you're more than welcome to go out to the lobby. Pastor Sharon is going to be out there, and she is going to just have an opportunity, a chance to be able to share with you the story of Bright City, how Bright City came about. It's a great way to get your questions answered and to be able to learn a little bit more about your story and how you got here at Bright City. So that's one way. Another way is texting Bright City. You could do that right now. You could text Bright City, all one word, to 94000. I think it's 3 zeros. 2 zeros? 3 zeros? Yeah, 3 zeros. 3. Boom. Thanks for helping me out. 3 zeros. So Bright City, all one word, to 94000. What you're going to get is you're going to get a link tree. You're going to get a link. You're going to be able to find a way to get connected through that link tree. Again, it's awesome. Another thing is, in front of all of you guys, there is a connection card there that you have in front of you. You can fill this out. Guest services will pick this up at the end of the service. But again, it's just a great way to get connected. The link tree that I had mentioned before also is just a digitized version of this connection card. So you can go that route also. So speaking of connect, another great way of getting connected here is by serving. Serving here at Bright City, our servant leaders, it's an act of worship. Us being able to serve you, serving our community, it's what we're called to do as Christ followers. And so in that link tree that I had mentioned prior, you can get connected that way, but there's also a way in which you can email serve@brightcitychurch.com. If you have any questions, you want to learn more about the ministry opportunities here, you can do that by sending us an email. Lastly, another way to get connected is by giving. Giving here, again, is an act of worship. We're called to worship. All of life is worship, and we're able to give by a couple of ways in doing that. One is you can text to the number that you see on the screen that's behind me, or you can also go to brightcitychurch.com/give. You can also set up giving that way. And by giving, we're able to partner with Jesus and what he's doing in and through Bright City Church. And you may be saying, well, what are you guys doing here at Bright City Church? And I just want to point you to our vision that through all of what Christ has done, through his death and resurrection, and through faith in him, that we are restored to God, that we are restored to ourselves, and that we are restored to others. This is what Jesus is doing here at Bright City Church, and we want to be a part of that, and we hope that you want to be a part of that also. Well, last thing is we're kicking off, or not even kicking off, we've been in our sermon series on Proverbs and wisdom, and we're going to be talking about wisdom and sex. And some of y'all will be like, ooh, some of y'all going to be like, okay, what's that about? But I'm going to give Pastor Ike the hard task in being able to bring to the surface what that looks like. So thank you guys so much for being here.
Thank you, Eric. You sure you don't want to give the message today?
You got it. It's all you, man. You got it.
Well, Bright City family, it is just crazy to be in here. I am just blown away. As Eric said, we are not supposed to be in here. I was thinking this morning of where, God tells the Israelites, I'm going to take you to a land that I've shown you. And I've been walking by this theater for 3 years now and been seeing it here. And so to be here, knowing that we're the only church in America that's in an IMAX, it's just unbelievable the way that God has provided for our church and continues to do that. So awesome to see so many of you guys. We put up the barrier here as a way to encourage you guys not to go all the way to the back, but to use these seats so that it's not like, hey, you guys way back there, But it looks like we'll need to push that back a little bit next week, so we'll plan on doing that. But Yeah, so excited to be in here. Thank you guys for being a part of this. And, one of the things that's crazy, and this isn't to brag on numbers, but it is to say, what I'm grateful for in our community, which is a lot of churches right now are experiencing probably 40 to 50% of what they saw attendance-wise pre-COVID. And the fact that we are hitting our numbers pre-COVID right now is just unbelievable, and just a testament to God's faithfulness to growing this community, and to know that there's still people that aren't comfortable being here, which is completely understandable. And so God has just been so good and faithful to our community in so many ways, and so just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that this morning. All right. Well, as Eric said, we are continuing our series in Proverbs, and this week we are looking at the conversation around wisdom and sex. And so I want to give a warning to parents. If you didn't see our notice about doing this conversation, wanted to give you a chance if you feel like this might not be an appropriate conversation for your child to take them over to Kids City if you would like, but not going to get graphic or anything, but may use some terminology that not all parents are comfortable with. But throughout this series, we've been talking about wisdom for your life, and we've talked about how you can't fool wisdom. That the path of foolishness will always show itself. At some point, we will reach the bitter end of the path of foolishness, and it will reveal itself. We've talked about that with friendships and wisdom in friendships. We've talked about taming the tongue last week, and this week we are coming to wisdom and sex. And this is a conversation that is for everybody in this room. If you are single, this is an important conversation because I know for those of us that are single, that sometimes our desires and our convictions are at odds with one another. That what we feel in our body and what we believe are at odds with one another, which leads us to question, okay, which is right? Which one do I follow? Which do I follow through on? And so I hope to work towards some clarity on that question. For those of us that are married, this question of sex is critical for the marriage relationship. It can be a part of building up the relationship and strengthening the relationship, but the decisions that we make in this area can also tear down the relationship and break the relationship. And so this morning we're going to be talking about how do we make sure we're taking wise steps to build up the marriage relationship in this area. So this is a conversation that I think is important for everyone. But we're going to do that by way of looking at King Solomon sharing a story with his son. And this is a story that when we read it, if you haven't read this before, you're going to be like, that's in my Bible? I'm not sure I'm comfortable with my kids reading this anymore. You're kind of like, okay, is this The Young and the Restless? Like, was this written for a soap opera, or is this really in here? So we're going to dive into this story. We're going to be in Proverbs chapter 7. And this is one of those passages that I think it's especially important to be aware that this is a father giving wisdom to his son. He is giving instruction to his son in this area of sex and sexuality. And so he's going to be telling his son a story. And the question that we're asking is, what is the story he's telling him? What is the lesson that he's giving his son? So, Proverbs chapter 7, beginning in verse 1. My son, obey my words and treasure my commands. Keep my commands and live, and guard my instructions as you would the pupil of your eye. Tie them on your fingers, write them on the tablet of your heart. Say to wisdom, you are my sister, and call understanding your relative. She will keep you from a forbidden woman, a wayward woman with her flattering talk. So he begins by setting this up by saying, pursue Lady Wisdom. Pursue her, seek after her, tie her around your fingers. Write her on the tablet of your heart. Guard these instructions because they will protect your life. And then he goes into this story, this parable that he is going to use as a means of giving his son a lesson. Verse 6, at the window of my house I looked through the lattice. I saw among the inexperienced, I noticed among the youths, a young man lacking sense. So he's talking about, he's looking out his window and he sees this young man going down the road. And he can tell that this is a man who lacks knowledge, who lacks understanding of how the world works. It says, crossing the street near her corner, he strolled down the road to her house. At twilight, in the evening, in the dark of the night, a woman came to meet him dressed like a prostitute, having a hidden agenda. She is loud and defiant. Her feet do not stay at home. Now in the streets, now in the squares, she lurks at every corner. So this young man is going down the street, and Solomon can see where this is headed. He looks down the road, and he can see where this is headed. He can see where it's headed literally, but also metaphorically. He knows where this is headed. Now, it's important to understand that the problem in this story is not the woman or how the woman is dressed. The problem in this story is what he already identified, which is this is a young man who lacks understanding, who lacks wisdom, who lacks experience of how the world works and understanding. And so the issue is not the woman, but it's his lack of understanding. More important is understanding that what is being contrasted here is Lady Wisdom and the wayward woman. Okay? So he's asking his son, which one are you going to follow? Are you going to follow the path of wisdom? Are you going to pursue and seek after Lady Wisdom? Or are you going to pursue and seek after the wayward woman, the path of foolishness? And I can see this going differently. Say he was talking to his daughter, using the same, but saying, okay, are you going to follow Sir Wisdom or go after the path of foolishness? Sir Foolishness, right? And so the point here is not the gender, but the question of which path are you going to go down? Who are you going to follow? It says she grabs him and kisses him. She brazenly says to him, I've made fellowship offerings. Today I fulfilled my vows. This language of brazenly says also means deceitfully says. She has lied very loudly. But what is this question about? Why is she talking about fellowship offerings? Why does she bring up having made these offerings? Well, the kind of offering that she had made is an offering where she would have sacrificed an animal and burned the fat, but she would be allowed to keep the meat. As the worshiper, she would be allowed to take the meat home, but the caveat, the requirement of this offering is that meat had to have to be consumed that day. And so she's telling this man, come with me. Look, I've got luxurious meat, plenty of food, a delicacy for us to enjoy together. And even better yet, you're going to be helping me fulfill my holy obligation. For you to come and to be with me, you're actually helping me fulfill my responsibility to God. In other words, hey, there's a way, you're doing this for God. How often in our decision making, especially in this area, do we find ways of making this something that God endorses? That we're doing this for God in some way. And we hear that and we think that is absurd, but when we're on the path of foolishness, we cannot see it. We do not see it. And so she says, so I came out to meet you, to search for you, and I've found you. I've spread coverings on my bed, richly colored linen from Egypt. I've perfumed my bed with myrrh, aloes, and cinnamon. Come, let's drink deeply of lovemaking until morning. Let's feast on each other's love. My husband isn't home. He went on a long journey. He took a bag of silver with him and will come home at the time of the full moon. So what she's saying is, we're not going to get caught. There's no risk here. You're not taking any chances. He's going to be gone for a long time. He took a bag of silver, which means he's going to be gone for a long time. And when you're on the path of foolishness, this accelerates your steps down the path when you find out there's no risk involved. There's nothing that's going to go wrong here. It's going to go fine. It will be fine, right? Those were the words that he needed to hear, to know this is going to work out. And so the story that this young man is telling himself at this moment is, man, this is living. This is an escapade if there ever was one. This is exciting. This is what it means to feel alive. This is a great story. I can't wait to tell my buddies this story, right? But this is a story within the story that Solomon is telling his son, which means the story's not over. There's more to the story. And so Solomon zooms out in verses 21 through 23 to give us a picture of what's actually going on. Verse 21, she seduces him with her persistent pleading. She lures him with her flattering talk. He follows her impulsively like an ox going to the slaughter, like a deer bounding toward a trap until an arrow pierces its liver. Like a bird darting into a snare, he doesn't know it will cost him his life. This is going somewhere very differently than where this young man thinks. it's going to end up somewhere very differently than what he anticipates. And so King Solomon is warning his son that the lure of sexual desire often does not take us where we think it's going to take us. I want to talk for a minute about allure and lures. There's a certain allure to this kind of story. It draws you in. There's an excitement to it. But he says in the end that he was being lured in. When we think of lures, what do we think of? What do you think of when you hear of lures? Fishing, that's right. So I had the opportunity a couple weeks ago to go to Montana, beautiful Montana, and a big part of our trip there was a group of pastors, kind of a pastor's retreat getting away, and I got to do some fly fishing, which I had never done before. And having never done this before, I assumed that fly fishing was called fly fishing because of you're kind of flying your rod back and forth in the air. I hear some chuckles. Obviously, that's not what it comes from. It actually comes from the kind of lure that you use when you're fishing. So when you fish on a river, you fly fish on a river, and trout, for example, will stay at the same place in the river, just kind of swimming upstream, and they're waiting for food to come down. Insects, bugs, flies to come down. And so they see something, they kind of swim over, grab it, and then they go back to where they are. And so fly fishing, you're standing in the river, or we were on a boat, you're casting out, you're letting the water carry your lure down. If nothing gets on it, you pull it back out, you cast it back, it goes down again. But the idea of the lure is imitating something that they would find attractive, something that they would want to eat. And I've got a picture here of, there it is, that's my whitefish. That's my 18-inch whitefish, so that was about the only one I caught out of like 8 hours of fishing, so not a super successful trip. But the idea of a lure is you are trying to imitate something that they will find attractive, appealing. But what the fish doesn't know is that the lure is promising something that he's not actually going to receive. The lure promises, hey, here's something for you to eat. Come and get it. But what the fish doesn't know is that the intent is not to satisfy their hunger, but to hook them on the hook. Right? They don't know that there's a hidden agenda. There's a different intent behind it, which is to get them to do something they would not be willing to do on their own. And what Solomon is telling his son here is that this path that this young man is on is a lure to get him to go somewhere he would not go on his own, which Solomon describes as an ox going to the slaughter. An ox would not go to the slaughter if he knew that's where he was headed. A deer would not go into a trap if he knew it was headed towards being shot with an arrow. A bird would not dart into a snare if he knew it was going to cost him his life. And when we take steps down this path of sexual desire, ends up oftentimes going somewhere we don't think it's going to take us. In this example, we see a young man that we don't know if he's married or not, but this woman is married, and an affair seems exciting, it seems stimulating, it seems promising, but in the end, what it really delivers is heartache. What it really delivers is brokenness. What it really delivers is pain. What it really delivers is broken relationships with our children. And that's somewhere none of us would willingly go on our own. To broken relationships with our children, that is not somewhere we would willingly go on our own. So this morning, I want to talk about how do we make wise decisions in this area? How do we keep from going somewhere we wouldn't go on our own? Part of the problem in this conversation, especially for those of us who grew up in the 80s and 90s, is we grew up in a culture called purity culture. You may have heard of that term, but essentially the idea was that much of the talk around sex, it was motivating abstinence by means of fear and threat. That if you do this, this is going to be the outcome. If you have premarital sex, you're going to get an STD. If you have premarital sex, you're going to get pregnant. And what happened at the end of the day is, for many people, that didn't happen. And so then it became the question, well, what's the big deal if that didn't happen? Why does it matter? Why can't we do this? This doesn't make sense. And there were a couple of problems with this approach that both come from accepting an unbiblical notion of sex and sexuality. The first issue is we allowed sexuality to be separated from spirituality. That when we see how sex was originally created between male and female, it was intended to be something that pointed towards the intimacy we were meant to experience with God. And so sexuality and spirituality were intended to belong together, to point beyond something just between a man and a woman, between a couple. Rich Villodas, an author, says this. He says, when this happened, religion got spirituality and secularism got sexuality, which kind of feels like a raw deal, right? But the second thing that was wrong with this idea is that society then reduced sexuality to the physical act of intercourse. It reduced all of sexuality, all of what sexuality is meant to mean, to purely the physical act. And so we've been led to believe that someone is only expressing their sexuality if they are engaged in that physical act. And so within the church, what happened is consequently sexual desire was labeled as bad, something we should avoid feeling. And there was this immense guilt and shame that was associated with not being able to not feel it. And so in separating spirituality and sexuality, the church became a place where we shouldn't speak about these things. We shouldn't talk about these things. But in reality, the church should be the place that helps us make sense of these longings. If God is the one that gave them to us in the first place, he should be the one that's informing how we think about what we do with them. And so this morning, I want to spend some time reframing how we think about this, to help us think about this more holistically, how to bring these things back together that have been pulled apart. And I want to use a resource. Rich Villodas is a pastor in New York. In Brooklyn, he has a church called New Life Fellowship. But he just wrote a book called The Deeply Formed Life, where he looks at 5 areas of our lives where we need to be formed and looks at how to be formed in those areas. And one of those areas that he talks about is sexual wholeness. And so I want to use that work to help reframe how we think about sexuality. The first thing that he does is offer a definition of sexuality, something that's more all-encompassing of what we mean by sexuality. And so this is a definition that comes from Deborah Hirsch. It says, sexuality is longing to know and be known by others on physical, emotional, psychological, and spiritual levels. It's a much more holistic vision than just the physical act. It's a desire to deeply bond with others, to be seen and to be known by others, to know others and to see others. And so it's not just a purely physical act. But in our culture, we've been socialized into thinking that the best way to be, quote, naked and seen by someone is to be seen naked by someone, right? But there's so much more to it. And in fact, I think we have become so uncomfortable with really being known that it's almost more comfortable to do this than to share our challenges, to share to be vulnerable, to be transparent, to be known. And so I want to make a helpful distinction here that helps to see this picture more holistically, which is within this broad umbrella of sexuality, there's what we would call social intimacy and physical intimacy. Social intimacy is this need and desire and longing to bond with others in deeply meaningful ways, to know others, to be known, whereas physical intimacy refers more specifically to the act of sex or intercourse. And what happens when we don't know the difference between these, when we can't parse these out, we unwisely rush to physical intimacy when what we really needed was social intimacy. The experience of connecting and bonding deeply with another. Especially for those of you who are single, when we don't know the difference between these, we often rush to the physical act when what we really needed was that connection, that social intimacy of being known and knowing another. I want to talk about a false form of sexuality this morning, and it's the issue of pornography. And how pornography is this false form of sexuality. It's a false form of sexuality because it's attempting to experience this physical intimacy and connection by watching others engage in it. But the result of that is neither physical intimacy nor social intimacy. In fact, there's an emptiness because that void was never addressed. And in fact, we pursued something that did not take us where we thought it was going to take us. And so we've seen in studies that the consequence of this actually is a greater inability to engage in physical intimacy because of viewing pornography. It actually inhibited our ability to pursue what it is we wanted in the first place, which was that physical intimacy with another person. And so it's a false form of sexuality. So what do we do with this? What do we do with understanding social intimacy and physical intimacy? Well, what we know from the beginning is that humanity was made for community and intimacy with each other. But in assessing sexuality in our culture, what we see is that we've placed so much weight on the fulfillment of our sexual desires we believe that it can give us, and though it was not permanent, we have to go back to it again and again. We've forgotten that sexuality itself was not to be an end in itself, but it was to point us to something beyond ourselves. And so wisdom is the ability to see the difference between social intimacy and physical intimacy and ask the question, what is it that I'm really desiring? I want to encourage you to begin doing that work of assessing what's going on, because oftentimes we will short circuit what our very body is telling us about our need to connect with God and others simply by watching pornography or hooking up because we believe that's what we are really after. G.K. Chesterton has this famous quote where he says, "The man who knocks on the door of the brothel unknowingly does so seeking God." That he is seeking something and believes that this is the answer, but really he's seeking something deep in his soul that this will never satisfy. And this was the wisdom of a covenant marriage relationship. That when God brought man and woman together to this relationship, the intention was not just for their fulfillment, but that the intimacy that they experienced with one another would point them towards the intimacy that they were created to have with God. That to become one is a picture of the oneness that we're also made to have with God. And so each time that we have sex with a different person, we are uniting with that person, and then the only way that two who have become one can become two again is by tearing that apart. In other words, what's essentially happening is there's a tearing of our soul that's taking place. It is tearing at our souls that were intended to be in unity with a covenant partner and with God. This is why when we see Jesus talk about sexual immorality in the New Testament, or Paul talking about it, the word there literally means fornication. It's literally sex with anyone that you're not married to. It's very specific. Sexual immorality is the translation that many of us see that's like, what does that even mean? But it's very specific in that way. So what do we do with our desires then? What do we do with these desires that are in us, that are undeniable, that were placed there by God? What do we do with those? I want to get really practical for a moment, because I know that's what many of us are thinking is I still have these desires. And so we're going to go back to the question we asked at the beginning of this series, which is, what is the wise thing to do? You know, one of the things that characterizes so much of folly in Proverbs is the inability to see the bigger picture, the broader outcomes, the long-term impact. And that's what Solomon is trying to tell his son here, is that there's a bigger picture. There's something more going on here. There's some consequences to this that this young man cannot yet see. And so when we look at the taming the tongue, you know, it was the foolish person who runs their mouth to make their point, to win the argument, to tear somebody down. But it's the wise one who weighs the cost of their words before he uses them. And so when it comes to sexual desires, what we often see is that the lure of sex blinds us to seeing clearly and thinking clearly about anything else. It blinds us to thinking clearly and to seeing larger, broader outcomes. And so as I was preparing this message, I wondered, okay, is there something scientific going on here? Is there something biological happening in us that makes it difficult for us to think clearly once we have begun to feel some sexual desire in a moment? And so I did a little research. This is probably an oversimplification of things, but to give you kind of the idea of what's going on, when we begin to feel sexual desire, something called the limbic system takes over. It's kind of the oldest, kind of most basic part of our brain, which says, I need food, I need sex, and I need shelter, right? That's what it is, bent on providing. And so when we begin to feel sexual desire, this system redirects blood from the brain to the parts of the body that needs it. You know what I'm saying? All right. And so in this, our higher thought process parts of the brain, such as the prefrontal cortex, have minimal supply of blood and oxygen. What that means is these parts of our body, of our brain that are intended for complex thinking are compromised. The parts of our brain that are meant to help us process things such as our future, our relationships, ethical and moral decisions are compromised because the blood flow has gone elsewhere. After the fact, then the limbic system releases control. Blood immediately goes back to the other parts of the brain, and we kind of return to ourselves, as it were. We regain higher levels of thought processing. But I tell you this not to give you an excuse for foolish decisions, okay? I'm not saying, okay, this is what your body does, so you just go with it, okay? I'm telling you this so that you understand how your body works so you can prevent bad decisions before the blood leaves the brain, right? Before you find yourself in a situation where you're not thinking clearly. Just because your body naturally feels things and does things in response to something doesn't mean it's wise to follow through on it. That's why we were given brains in the first place. And so the first thing I want to encourage you to do is to learn to identify the path of foolishness. You know, when Solomon is telling his son this story, he's saying, look, there's a lot of steps from his house to down the street to across the street to in her house. Like there were a lot of steps where he could have asked, is this the wise thing to do? And so I want to invite you to begin to learn, what are the paths you find yourself going down when you are headed in a foolish direction? Maybe it's paths you've walked down before, and it's discerning, okay, how do I know early enough on not to go down that path? Maybe it's somebody that we need to stop texting at 2 o'clock in the morning. Maybe it's certain things that we're watching. Maybe it's people that we're with. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's certain places that you go. Maybe it's a certain amount of alcohol that you drink. How do you learn the path of foolishness so that you can see it before you get too far down it? And then the second thing is to discern whether you're being driven by a desire for social intimacy or physical intimacy. Physical intimacy and the social intimacy is this deep sense of connection with others. For those of us who are single, when we don't distinguish these, we end up rushing to the physical intimacy to address that, to address what really was just the need for deep connection with another human being. Or in the absence of someone to rush to, we isolate ourselves. And then we don't even experience any of the social intimacy, which is what we may well have wanted and needed in the first place. So to discern what's driving your action, what is it that you truly need? This is the work of wisdom. Husbands and wives, in our marriages, it's important, obviously, that physical intimacy is a part of that relationship. It's a crucial part of it. But we can become so preoccupied with whether there is enough of the physical intimacy that we forget about or neglect the social intimacy that was created for that relationship as well. And then it becomes a spiral in which there's not social intimacy, and that feeds a lack of physical intimacy, and a lack of physical intimacy feeds a lack of social intimacy in that relationship. And so thinking through, what is it that your marriage needs? Does it need more physical intimacy? Does it need more social intimacy in order to experience the fullness of sexuality that was created for that relationship? I want to give you a few questions for reflection as we draw to a close here. The first one is, what's the bigger picture of the sexual decisions you're making? Like this young man who could not see the bigger picture of where he was headed. What's the bigger picture of where you are headed with your sexual decisions? The second one is, what's the outcome you can't see beyond the pleasure it seems to promise? So like the fish who can only see the fly, who can't see the line or the reel, what's behind what's luring you? What's the broader outcome? What's the trap that you are being lured into? Is it damage to other relationships in your life? Is it damage to future relationships in your life? And then lastly, what is it that you're being lured into that you wouldn't be willing to go to on your own? If this man couldn't see that he was being drawn into doing something, namely at his cost of his life, if he couldn't see that that was taking him somewhere he wouldn't have gone on his own, where is it that you are being taken that you wouldn't go if you knew that's where it was headed? Maybe this morning you are hearing this message and you're feeling some shame and some guilt for mistakes that have been made in this area, like many of us have. And maybe you've been told at some point in your life that because of this, God doesn't love you, or that God can't love you, or God loves you, but it's kind of like in spite of you kind of thing. And what I want you to hear, what I want you to know is that there is love. There is forgiveness. And in fact, he loves us desperately and longs to have the kind of intimacy with you that we long to have with one another. That's what it's a picture of. It's a picture of God's desperate desire to have intimacy with us. That's why it's been placed in us. God longs with a holy passion for intimacy with you and with me. And the desires that we feel are intended to help us understand God's desire for relationship with us. Let us pray. God, these are challenging conversations. And we come with many stories of our own, many experiences of our own, many questions of our own. And God, I pray that you would meet us here in this time. Meet us right now in this moment. God, speak the words to us that we need to hear, the words of love, the words of grace, the words of forgiveness, the words of peace, the words of wisdom. God, I pray that we would do the hard work of identifying what it is that we truly need, what it is that our desires are really leading us towards. God, protect us from the path of foolishness. I pray for the single men and women here and, God, the challenges that we face and the longings and the desires that are at work in us and sometimes being at odds with those in our convictions. Give us wisdom. Give us an ability to see the path of foolishness before we get down it. God, for couples here this morning, God, I pray for the decisions that they are making sexually. God, that they would be making decisions that build up their marriage, not tear it down. That they would see the unique needs of their relationship and lean into them. Lean into that need to bond deeply, to know and to see one another more clearly before taking that step of physical intimacy. God, help us to see with greater clarity what our relationships need. Give us wisdom in this crucial area of life. And most of all, God, may we understand as a result of our desires how deeply it is that you desire and long for us. In Jesus' name, amen.